Hey guys, welcome to video number 2 for chapter 23. And in this one, we're going to be talking about social and economic reforms in Great Britain. So in the previous video, we discussed political reforms in Great Britain that resulted in the expansion of voting rights and changes to Parliament. In this video, we're going to discuss some significant social and economic changes that took place in both Great Britain and Ireland, which was under British rule at the time. First, let's talk about some significant social reforms that took place. A major one was the abolition movement. Now, abolition movement was about ending slavery. It gained momentum in the 1700s after the Enlightenment. And then in 1807, Britain was the first major country to end the slave trade. Now, that doesn't effectively end slavery. It means that they will no longer engage in capturing Africans and then selling them anywhere all over the world, whether it's in Europe or the Americas. And then also in 1833, slavery was banned finally in all British colonies. So, while they were largely responsible for, a lot of slavery in the Americas, Britain did end slavery or abolish slavery within its own territories a couple of decades before the United States eventually abolished slavery. Other reforms were aimed at the criminal justice system. A major change was reducing the number of capital offenses. Capital offenses are crimes that are punishable by death. Right, so hanging was the most common way that you would execute somebody by the 1800s. And in the year 1810, there were over 200 crimes punishable by death in Britain. Now, murder was obviously one, but so was shoplifting, impersonating an army officer, even stealing sheep. I mean, you look at the line there, stealing from a shipwreck, malicious maiming of cattle, so you can't hurt horses, even strong evidence of malice in children 7 to 14 years old. Yeah, they executed people, they would hang children as young as 8, 9 years of age. So eventually they realized that, okay, this was a bit much. We need to do away with this. And by 1850, the death penalty was really just for serious crimes like murder and treason. Now, instead of executing them, many petty or small criminals were sent to what were called penal colonies or settlements for convicts. And Australia and New Zealand were two main spots for these. You see this from the landing of convicts at Botany Bay. Botany Bay is an area in Australia. And then in 1868, Parliament eventually ended public executions. So this, where you'd gather hundreds, if not thousands, of people for really big executions, that ended. I'm sure that ended a lot of people's fun, but still. That was a step in the right direction in terms of humane treatment of criminals. Now, we discussed in the previous video how working class men slowly gained the right to vote. This proved a powerful benefit as it resulted in numerous victories for workers. Once workers gained the right to vote, they started electing people to Parliament who would help them. This resulted in the improvement of working conditions. Laws were passed that restricted child labor. Mine and factory workers could no longer employ children under the age of 10, so you didn't see things quite like this anymore. You think, okay, well, they could still employ people, kids 11 or 12, yeah, for a little while, but still, it was a step in the right direction and would eventually lead to some further changes. And also, for the first time, safety regulations were created, where you would have inspections of factories and work sites and things of that nature. Other laws did things like set minimum wage, maximum number of work hours per day, things of that nature. Another consequence of the increased political power of workers was the growth of labor unions. Right? Remember, labor unions were outlawed in the early Industrial Revolution. And by the early 1900s, union membership was widespread, though. Their membership was swelling by the year. And they pushed for better working conditions and the passage of laws protecting workers. Other reforms meant to benefit the working class were the establishment of free elementary school for all children. Right, so these kids that were no longer working in the mines and the factories, they were now getting a free education. But you notice it was still just elementary. For once kids got older, 14, 15, 16 years of age, they still, for the most part, worked full time. But also for the creation of social welfare programs, such as workers' compensation if you're hurt in the job, or unemployment insurance. These programs were based on the ones created by Otto von Bismarck in Germany that we talked about in chapter 22. So it's important to note that all of these workers' changes were largely the result of workers gaining the right to vote. However, we're only talking about male workers. Women were not given the right to vote, and this led to a strong call for women's rights. By the early 1900s, women's suffragists still faced tremendous opposition. Even Queen Victoria herself didn't think that women should be given the right to vote. This led to more, widespread opposition. So this led to more aggressive tactics. Suffragists thought that the only way that they could get results by really being in people's faces. Now, they tried to keep them somewhat peaceful at first with demonstrations and gatherings and things like this, but when they didn't work, they sometimes turned to violent protests, such as vandalizing or even destroying voting stations. Here you have a famous picture of a leading suffragette from Britain, Emmeline Pankhurst, being pulled away forcefully by police officers. You can see creating quite a scene. Even actions such as this did not result in fast-moving reforms. It wasn't until 1918 that women were finally granted the right to vote, but only if they were over the age of 30. Right? So women younger than that, even in their 20s and so forth, still could not get the right to vote. Now, while Britain faced problems at home with social upheaval that we're talking about with slavery and women's rights and so forth, there were an awful lot of problems that they had to deal with in Ireland. All right, so let's talk about the Irish problem, or as the British referred to it. Now, this goes back hundreds of years. By the 1600s, England had fully colonized Ireland, and with that control, they took all the best farmland. And many of these English landowners, they were what we call absentee landlords, meaning they owned the land in Ireland but didn't even live there. Right. And you see how this map shows it's broken down by Catholic. In 1641, how the Catholics still own the majority of the land, but even by the beginning of the 1700s, they had lost most of it, and that wasn't getting any better into the 1800s. And these absentee landlords, even though they didn't live there, they charged exorbitant rents for the tenants that lived there, and it just kept them very, very poor. And a lot of this was based on religion. Right? Catholics were denied full rights because the British were predominantly Protestant. So you had that old Protestant versus Catholic battle coming to a head in Ireland still. And to make matters worse, in 1845, the potato famine hit. Now, potatoes were the primary food supply for the Irish. It wasn't that they were the only things the Irish could grow or that they loved potatoes so much, regardless of what the stereotypes became, but rather that the British controlled farm production, and the majority of crops such as oats, wheat, and corn were exported by the British to make money, leaving potatoes as really the only thing that the Irish could subside on. In 1845, a new strain of bacteria somehow made it into Ireland, and it wiped out the potato crop. Here you see a healthy potato on the left, and on the right you see the result of it. It took away all of its nutritional value. It basically became worthless and useless for them. Now, the rest of the crops and livestock were perfectly fine, but the British landlords refused to give them anything in order to feed the Irish. They kept all that for themselves for export so they could continue to make money. Consequently, over 1 million Irish died of disease and starvation, while another million emigrated to places like the United States and Canada. Now, the famine led to a massive increase in bitterness and anger among the Irish towards Great Britain, as well as sparking Irish nationalism. As Irish nationalism increased, so too did the call to end British rule. Now, some radical groups wanted the British out by any means necessary and would resort to violence to do so, but other moderate groups called for home rule. Home rule was where the British would still technically be in charge of Ireland, but the Irish would make all of their own decisions. Okay, they would rule their home. The debate over what to do with Ireland, it divided the British government for decades. The constant debate, as well as dealing with more radical groups in Ireland, was one of the reasons why the British referred to it as the Irish problem. Eventually, Parliament did pass a Home Rule Bill in 1914, but it was put on hold because of World War I, and other events would eventually lead to Irish independence that we'll talk about in a later chapter. So that kind of wraps things up to talk about social and economic reforms in Great Britain. And then in the next section, we are going to be talking about France.